A post office on Sunday. Pia had gone to bed too early and around midnight found herself wide awake, sitting up in her bunk. She spent a few minutes trying to drift off again and then gave up. Wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, she stepped out on the deck. The light of the waxing moon was so bright that she stood still for a moment, blinking. Then she saw to her surprise that Kanai was outside too. He was ready. He was reading by the light of a small kerosene lantern. Pia went forward and slipped into the other chair. "You're up late," she said. "Is that your uncle's notebook you're reading?" "Yes, I finished it actually. I was just looking it over again." "Can I have a look?" "Certainly." Kanai closed the book and held it out to her. She took the notebook gingerly and allowed it to fall open. "The writing's very small," she said. "Yes," said Kanai. "It's not easy to read." "And is it all in Bengali?" "Yes." She closed the book carefully and handed it back to Kanai. "So what's it about?" Kanai scratched his head as he wondered how best to describe the notebook. "It's about all kinds of things. Places, people." "Anyone you know?" "Yes, actually. Fakir's mother figures in a lot. Fakir too, though Nirmal only knew him when he was very small." Pia's eyes widened. "Fakir and his mother? How come they're in it?" "I told you, didn't I, that Kusum, Fakir's mother, was involved in an effort to resettle one of these islands?" "Yes, you did." Kanai smiled. "I think without knowing it, he may have been in love with Kusum." "Does he say so in the book?" "No," said Kanai, "but then he wouldn't." "Why not?" "Being what he was," Kanai said, "a man of his time and place with his convictions, he'd have thought it frivolous." Pia ran her fingers through her short curly hair. "I don't get it," she said. "What were his convictions?" Kanai leaned back in his chair as he thought this over. "He was a radical at one time," he said. "In fact, if you were to ask my aunt Nilima, she would tell you that the reason he got mixed up with the settlers in Morichapi was because he couldn't let go of the idea of a revolution." "I take it you don't agree with her?" "No," said Kanai. "I think she's wrong. As I see it, Nirmal was possessed more by words than by politics. There are people who live through poetry, and he was one of them. For Nilima, a person like that is very hard to understand. But that's the kind of man Nirmal was. He loved the work of Rainer Maria Rilke, a great German poet, whose work has been translated into Bangla by some of our best-known poets. Rilke said, 'Life is lived in transformation.' And I think Nirmal soaked this idea into himself in the way a cloth absorbs ink. To him, what Kusum was was the embodiment of Rilke's idea of transformation." "Marxism and poetry," Pia said dryly, raising her eyebrows. "It seemed like an odd combination." "It was," Kanai agreed, "but those contradictions were typical of his generation. Nirmal was perhaps the least materialistic person I've ever known, but it was very important for him to believe that he was a historical materialist." "And what does that exactly mean?" "For him, it meant that everything which existed was interconnected. The trees, the sky, the weather, people, poetry, science, nature. He hunted down facts in the way a magpie collects shiny things. Yet when he strung them all together, somehow they became stories of a kind." Pia rested her chin on her fist. "Can you give me an example?" Kenai thought about this for a minute. "I remember one of his stories. It has always stuck in my mind." "What's it about?" Do you remember Canning, the town where we got off the train? Sure, I remember Canning, Pia said. That's where I got my permit. It's not what I'd call a memorable place. Exactly, said Kanai. The first time I went there was in 1970 when Nirmal and Nilima brought me to Lucy Bari. I was disgusted by the place. I thought it was a horrible, muddy little town. I happened to say something to that effect, and Nirmal was outraged. He shouted at me, "A place is what you make of it." And then he told a story so unlikely I thought he'd made it up. But after I went back home, I took the trouble to look into it and discovered it was true. What was the story? Pia said. Do you remember? I'd love to hear it. All right, said Kanai. I'll try to tell it to you as he would have, but don't forget I'll be translating in my head. He would have told it in Bangla. Sure, go on. Kanai held up a finger and pointed to the heavens. All right then, comrades, listen. I'll tell you about the Matla River and a storm struck Matal and the Matlami of a lord who was called Kanin. Shono kan pete shono. Put your ears out so you can listen properly. Like so many other places in the Tide country, Canning was named by an Ingrej, and in this case it was no ordinary Englishman who gave it his name. Not only was he lord, he was a lot, nothing less than a viceroy, Lord Canning. This lot and his liege were generous in sprinkling their names around the country, as the later generations of politicians would be in scattering their ashes. You came across them in the most unexpected places, a road here, a jail there, an occasional asylum. No matter what Lady Canning was tall, thin and peppery. A Calcutta sweet maker took it into his head to name a new confection after her. This sweet was black, round, and sugary. In other words, it was everything its namesake was not, which was lucky for the sweet maker because it meant his creation quickly became a success. People gobbled up the new sweet at such a rate that they could not take the time to say Lady Cannon. The name was soon shortened to Lady Jenny. Now surely there must exist a law of his speech which says that if Lady Cannon is to become Lady Jenny, then Port Canning should become Porta Jenny, or possibly Pa Jenny. But look, the port's name has survived undamaged and nobody ever calls it by anything but the Lord's name, Cannon. But why? Why would Allah leave the comforts of his throne in order to plant his name in the mud of the Matla? Well, remember Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the mad sultan who moved his capital from Delhi to a village in the middle of nowhere? It was a bee from the same hive that stung the British. They got it in their heads that they needed a new port, a new capital for Bengal. Calcutta's Hooghly River was silting up and its docks, they said, would soon be choked with mud. Chotararti, teams of planners and surveyors went out and wandered the land, striding about in wigs and breeches, mapping and measuring, and at last on the banks of the Matla they came on a place that caught their fancy, a little fishing village that overlooked a river so broad that it looked like a highway to the sea. Now, it's no secret that the word Matla means mad in Bangla, and everyone who knows the river knows also that his name has not been highly earned. But those Ingrej town planners were busy men who had little time for words and names. They went back to the lot and told him about the wonderful location they had found. They described the wide, mighty river, the flat plain and deep channel that led straight to the sea. They showed him their plans and maps and listed all the amenities they would build: hotels, promenades, parks, palaces, banks, streets. Oh, it was to be a grand place, this new capital on the banks of the mad Matla. It would lack for nothing. The contracts were given out and the work began. Thousands of mistries and mahajans and overseers moved to the shores of the Matla and began to dig. They drank the Matla's water and worked in the way that matals and madmen work. Nothing could stop them, not even the uprising of 1857. If you were here, then, on the banks of the Matla, you would never have known that in the northern Indian chapatis were passing from village to village, that Mangla Pandey had turned his gun on his officers, that women and children were being massacred and rebels were being tied to the mouths of cannons. Here on the banks of the smiling river, the work continued. An embankment arose, foundations were dug, a strand was laid out, a railway line built. And all the while the Matla lay still and waited. But not even a river can hide all its secrets, and it so happened that at that time in Kolkata there lived a man of mentality not unlike the Matlas. This was a lowly shipping inspector, an Ingrej Saheb by the name of Henry Pennington. Before coming to India, Pennington Saheb had lived in the Caribbean, and somewhere in those islands he had fallen in love. Not with a woman, nor even with a dog, as is often the case with lonely Englishmen living in faraway places. No, Mr. Pennington fell in love with storms. Out there, of course, they call them hurricanes, and Pennington Saheb's love for them knew no limits. He loved them not in the way you might love the mountains or the stars. For him, they were like books or music, and he felt for them the same affection a devotee might feel for his favorite authors or musicians. He read them, listened to them, studied them, and tried to understand them. He loved them so much that he invented a new word to describe them: cyclone. Now, our Kolkata may not be as romantic a place as the West Indies, but for the cultivation of Pennington Saheb's love affair, it was just as good. In the violence of its storms, the Bay of Bengal, let it be said, is second to none, not to the Caribbean, not to the South China Sea. Wasn't it our Tufan, after all, that gave birth to the word typhoon? When Mr. Pennington learned of the Viceroy's new port, he understood at once the madness the river had in mind. Standing on its banks, he spoke his mind. "Maybe you could trick those surveyors," he said, "but you can't make a fool of me. I've seen through your little game, and I'm going to make sure that they know too." And the Matla laughed its mental laugh and said, go on, do it now, tell them. It's you they'll call Matla, a man who thinks he can look into the hearts of rivers and storms." Sitting in his room in Kolkata, Pennington Saheb drafted dozens of letters. He wrote to the planners and surveyors and warned of the dangers. He told them it was crazy to build a town so deep in the tide country. The mangroves were Bengal's defense against the bay, he said. They served as a barrier against nature's fury, absorbing the initial onslaught of cyclonic winds, waves, and tidal surges. If not for the tide country, the plains would have been drowned long before. It was the mangroves that kept the hinterland alive. Kolkata's long, winding sea lane was thus its natural defense against the turbulent energies of the bay. The new port, on the other hand, was dangerously exposed. Given an unfortunate conjunction of winds and tides, even a minor storm would suffice to wash it away. All it would take was a wave stirred up by a cyclone. Driven to desperation, Mr. Pennington even wrote to the Viceroy, begging him to rethink the matter. He made a prediction. If the port was built at this location, he said, it would not last more than 15 years. There would come a day when a great mass of salt water would rise up in the midst of a cyclone and drown the whole settlement. On this he would stake his reputation as a man and as a scientist. Of course, no one paid any attention. Neither the planners nor the Lat Saheb had the time to listen. Mr. Pennington, after all, was nothing but a lowly shipping inspector, and he stood very low in the Ingrej scale of caste. People began to whisper that he was a man so mental. Who could blame him if there was a little gondoggle in his mind? Wasn't he the one who'd once been heard to say that the storms were wonderful meteors? So the work went on, and the port was built. Its streets and strand were laid out, its hotels and houses were painted and made ready, and everything went exactly as planned. One day, with much noise and drum beating, the viceroy planted his feet on the matchless flanks and gave the town its new name, Port Cannon. Pennington Shaheb was not invited to the ceremony. On the streets of Kolkata, people laughed and sniggered now when they saw him pass by. Oh, there goes that old Matal Pennington. Wasn't he the one who kept bothering the lad Shaheb about his new port? Hadn't he made a prediction of some kind, staking his reputation? Wait, said Pennington. Wait. I said 15 years. The Matla took pity on this Matal. 15 years was a long time, and Mr. Pennington had already suffered enough. It let him wait 1 year, and then one more, and yet another, until 5 long years had gone by. And then one day, in the year 1867, it rose as if to challenge and hurled itself upon Cannon. In a matter of hours, the town was all but gone. Only the bleached skeleton remained. The destruction came about just as Mr. Pennington had said it would. It was caused not by some great tufan, but by a relatively minor storm. Nor was it the storm's winds that wrecked the city. It was a wave, a surge. In 1871, 4 years after the Matlas uprising, the port was formally abandoned. The port, that was to be one of the reigning queens of the Eastern Oceans, a rival to Bombay, Singapore, and Hong Kong, became instead the Matlas vassal, Cannon. But as always with Nirmal, said Kanai, the last word was reserved for Rilke. He put his hand on his heart and recited aloud. But oh, how strange the streets of the city of pain! Oh, how an angel could stamp out their market of comforts, with the church nearby, bought ready-made, clean, shut and disappointed as a post office on Sunday. So, now you know, said Kanai as Pia began to laugh. That is what Cannon has been ever since that day in 1867 when the Matla stamped out the lad's handiwork, a Sunday post office.